Uh, for all those who do not know Uma, I'll just give a brief background of Uma. So, Uma is a chairperson and founder of CL. Uma holds a doctorate in finance and is an expert in the capital markets. She was a professor at Indian Institute of Capital Market, and which is now known as NISM. She has worked with ICICI Prudential Mutual Fund, and she was also a chief R&D officer at ING's Optimex. She has been a personal finance columnist from 2003 and currently writes in a weekly column in ET Wealth every week. She has been on several committees and working groups in the mutual fund industry. Uma has been the chairperson of the examination committee of the FPSP board and subject matter expert for the NCFM also. Now, she drives the vision and strategy at CL and now is focusing on the content and research across the print and digital media. She works from Atlanta. So she's here with us from Atlanta and it is 6:30 a.m. in the morning. She's got up that early and she's all there for us. Uma, so basically, since you will be talking for 45 minutes and then we can just have a Q&A session and we have Amit also to grill you a little bit.
Sure, sure. Bring it on. Sure. Thank you, Sangeeta. Thank you.
Okay.
Always a pleasure to talk. And I must thank FIFA for bringing me back to the front of such a large group of people again. It is the tragedy of our times that I can't see the audience, but I think we all have gotten used to the Zoom format of talking now. Which is good for CL, because at CL we always said that virtual learning is a good thing, and people felt um, face-to-face classroom is better. But then I think these times have shown us that these formats can also work, and that these formats can also be useful. I'm very happy to see about 150 participants who are there today, and I hope that I would make it a good value add for you on a Friday evening. Thank you for joining in. Okay, this is a series which we put together. FIFA, CL have worked together to put this together. This is going to be a 45-minute kind of a conversation, a monthly conversation in which we're going to bring in a few ideas that are being discussed in the market and kind of provide, hopefully provide advisors with concepts, some perspectives, as well as some takeaways which can help in their business. This is not going to be data heavy, presentation heavy format, which a lot of you are already going through those formats in your work. So we have about 4 sections here. The first section will be a bit of news that is there, which matters to you, and we'll just discuss that. And then there will be, I hope to provide a book review, or I hope to provide a discussion on a particular topic. This week, we're going to look at Tamal Bandyopadhyay's book called Pandemonium. Very interesting book that just got released. And for those of you waiting, happy to hear the author, I think in a week or two, he's going to be talking about the book too. I can send across the link. And then we are going to, FIFA was very keen that we talk about behavioral finance. So we'll take on one particular idea and try to discuss that. And then towards the end, we will talk about asset allocation, which is something which we keep coming back to. Some thoughts and some ideas about from research and from other things about asset allocation. So we have these 4 segments. Based on your feedback and based on how you're doing, we will probably change it and modify it as we go along. So let me get started. So the first one is news time, as we said. Now, in news time segment, what I want to discuss is the RBI policy. Okay, so this is something that media will bring about, and then for you as advisors, you can't escape that conversation in terms of what is happening to the interest rates. Okay, now RBI has not changed the interest rates. We know that is what it is. But in terms of two key takeaways, two things that you might want to keep coming back to. The first one is that RBI has not said adequate liquidity, they have said ample liquidity. So that very clearly means, I mean, in a sense that the requirement for keeping money available, there is aplenty, liquidity is aplenty. We know that the reverse repo window of RBI is where all the money is, all the banking money is getting parked. So we know that. But so the first point that I want you to remember is this, that we will not be looking at deployment, credit, growth for some time. I think at least for another quarter, if not for 2 quarters, there will be the situation of liquidity. There will be the situation of focus on availability of money rather than deployment of money. So we are in that phase of monetary policy where, we just out of a crisis, if we can say that, we're just trying to crawl out of a crisis. So in that kind of a situation, it's not going to be deployment, growth and all of that. Those are not issues we'll talk about. So it is going to be about liquidity, which obviously means if banks are parking at 3.35 or those kind of rates, we are therefore staring at very low levels of, we're looking at short-term markets and we're looking at very low levels of return for parking money, which means expected returns when you're looking at the segment is going to get kind of revised downwards in mentally, in terms of saying that we're going to get, no one pays for liquidity, right? You get returns when money is deployed. So we are in a phase where the businesses are not in a place where they are deploying, but they're just parking, which means that we are in a phase where we get absolutely safe return because liquid markets they don't default at all. And RBI is there saying that there will be ample liquidity, so we can rule out default completely. And we know that the short end of the market is where costs are lower. So therefore, the first takeaway for us is this, that focus on liquidity. The second takeaway is this, that, there can be all these conversations about what RBI should do and so on and so forth. But the focus is going to really be on keeping rates low. I don't know, every time we talk about monetary policy, there are at least 3-4 different ideas that come about. One is, inflation is going up and therefore rates have to go up, or, growth has to be encouraged and RBI is trying to encourage growth and RBI will focus on growth, and, interest rates, credit offtake is not happening and therefore this is what will happen to interest rates, etc. The truth is that which central bank anywhere in the world will increase interest rates the next 2 quarters? No one. No one. Not a single central bank will increase interest rates because we are not even in a place where credit is expanding, right? We are not even in a place where economic activity has picked up. So from a policy perspective, I mean, it is good for the media to come and say RBI has prioritized growth over inflation. I don't think they will care. Inflation can, I mean, you can, and there are comments which say, oh, inflation targeting is no longer important. I mean, the priorities from where we are now are so different. These are not normal times. So we can't forget that. So therefore, none of those arguments will keep coming. In the next 2 months, 6 months, we will keep talking about it. Is the growth happening? Is credit offtake happening? And so on and so forth. But from an interest rate policy perspective, there's really no choice but to keep the rates where they are. There's no scope for increasing them. So it's important to remember these two things. It's important to remember that we're in a phase where most money is in the liquid markets, and we are in a phase where it's extremely difficult to increase interest rates. So that is where the focus is at this time. So that was the first segment. That was what I wanted to say. Dhruv, you believe I should take questions as I move from one segment to another?
No, I think you can. think you can continue. I mean, we don't seem to have got any questions so far.
Okay.
But Amit, would you like to ask some specific questions on the debt side right
I've
now?
written it down, Dhruv, and I will ask it probably at the end of the session, because then we'll have continuity in the Q&A.
All right.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Amit. Thanks, Dhruv. Okay. So the next segment is what I call the book nook, or the space where I will be discussing a book or something that I believe you will benefit from reading, both from the point of view of practice as well as perspective. And the book that I'm happy to recommend this month is Tamal Bandyopadhyay's book, Pandemonium, a great Indian banking tragedy. Tamal has been, his column Bankers Trust, which ran in Mint for the longest time, and then now it runs in Business Standard. I recommend that you read his column, his weekly column. Tamal is a journalist, but he also, you might know, is associated with the Bandhan Bank. He is very respected in terms of his views, his association, and his access in the banking industry. His book, for example, features one-on-one interviews with 4 RBI governors. It's very valuable for just that section where he is able to ask Mr. Reddy about what happened during the global crisis. He is able to ask Mr. Subbarao, how he was dealing with the sudden expansion in infrastructure funding. And of course, Raghuram Rajan's views on the whole quality conditions that he imposed on the bank balance sheet, and how that asset quality review kind of modified everything for the banking system. We can keep clear of the political discussion around, how much the governors were able to do and so on and so forth. But Tamal's book is a fantastic summary of what is going wrong with the banking system. It contains a lot of horror stories. Okay, so it highlights where the systemic flaws are. In fact, he makes that comment at the start as well as at the end of the book. What can we say at this time? Can we say that we have let down Indian banking? Or given the number of banks that are failing and, once glorious names have become weak, so should we say we have let down Indian banking? Or should we say Indian banking has let us down? Maybe both are true. Because Indian banking could have been. So the book is a discussion of what could have been in terms of banking. So I will discuss a few takeaways which are interesting for us from the financial advisory business. I think debt markets and what's happening in debt markets is something that we are always very interested in knowing and understanding about. Now, one fundamental difference between what happens in an institutional kind of lending and a market kind of lending is the management of risk. See, we all know that lending as a business is extremely attractive and profitable because you are able to access funds at a certain rate and you're able to give it, because in India, the credit penetration is so low, the requirement for credit is so high. And if we are going to grow the way we are projected to grow, we will continue to need money. Okay, so there is no doubt about it. Businesses need the money. But so the lender's primary specialization is being able to lend with adequate due diligence and recover that loan. I mean, that's really the crux. What the book points out is how this risk management is still not happening as efficiently as it should. See, in a traditional system, let's say a DFI kind of lending or the traditional bank kind of lending. What used to happen is that the banker would do a credit appraisal and then the banker would provide a loan. And there will be an internal audit or there will be an RBI supervision and, and so on and so forth, coming and looking at whether this loan was, whether the book is good and so on and so forth. But banks largely remained conservative in terms of where they stretched themselves. They were in working capital, or as they expanded, they were into retail. But when the risk manifests, so when you find that there is a default, you start trying to act at that point in time. That's going to be such a problematic thing, because one, you have to have the willingness to admit that something went wrong. Tamal points out that that's a big problem, because several banks, the stories of evergreening of debt, I mean, I think everyone should read what are the various things they did, kicking the can down, um, trying to one bank trying to sell its credit to another, and trying to do a takeaway where, you lend for 5 years and then you say 5 more years and then you say 5 more years. So the whole evergreening effort, that is trying to keep a non-performing asset performing in your books, a certain kind of denial, and that is happening because your credit risk is being managed when it actually hits your books, when an NPA happens, when an interest payment has actually not come. So technically what you can do is, I mean, one of the easiest ways to evergreen is to make a token payment on the 89th day, so that on the 90th day, you still are a standard asset, so to say. So the problem primarily lies there, where this whole credit risk is not managed while making the loan, while monitoring the loan, while supervising whether such a loan was made well, with actual knowledge on the ground. There was a time when the banker knew who the clients were. So you had a good, there are horror stories of where banks have lent for projects which never happened. There's nothing happening. Okay, money has been lent. The promoter has taken the money and run away. And the banker realizes that the project has not even begun. There's no such project. So you have situations where there is absolutely no knowledge of what's happening on the ground. So the whole risk management in the lending market as we speak is bad, which is a matter of concern. But what is our alternative? Now, the traditional book banking is to kind of do all of these as specific activities. So supervision will mean that every loan will be reviewed. Internal audit will mean that every loan will be questioned. And credit monitoring will mean that the banker will actually visit, see and monitor the loans, and so on and so forth. Now, we've given all of that up because after the 90s, we have committed to what we know as the market approach for lending, or the whole idea that a bank which is capitalized, where you will follow the norms for provisioning and the norms for capital adequacy, you will be in good health without getting into the micro details of what's happening to the loans that a bank has made. That hasn't taken off at all. So when you say market for debt, I mean, which is where the mutual funds come in. What you're trying to say here is you're not waiting for the risk to manifest. What you're doing is you're using market price as an indicator of what's going wrong. So whether you will hold that debt in your books or not will not depend on provisioning and NPA and capital. And you're not using the books of accounts to manage your credit risk, but you're managing credit risk using the market, which means that you're looking at the market price or the market information as an indicator of whether the quality of the loan has changed and whether you want to keep it in your books or not. Now, mutual funds got caught in this crossfire because the credit system, as we know, the old system, not present, credit is expanding rapidly and quickly becoming poor quality credit because no one is really doing, I'll come to that point. So you have risks that are piling up on one side, and on the other, you have pretty much no market at all. I mean, the reason why we don't have a market is that most of the institutions that take on this debt, except for mutual funds is that one small exception. None of them is holding these assets with the intention to trade them if their values change. So everyone is holding to maturity: a cooperative bank, a DFI, a pension fund, an insurance company, a trust, a society, a pension a Provident Fund Trust, pretty much everybody. So everybody in the system, and the treasury activity in the banks is almost entirely GSEC oriented. So no bank really, because the bank is making a loan, the bank is not really issuing paper. So what is happening is that there is loan whose quality has changed. So it was expected to be something, it has become bad, but there is a huge hole in the system in terms of what will happen to these loans and who is looking at the deterioration in these loans. So Tamal's book is a fantastic account of this institutional weakness, which will continue to make keep credit markets risky. Because we all know that the way the whole credit opportunity space came about because of this gap, saying that, look, banks are not doing this, therefore NBFCs will do it, because NBFCs are still private, NBFCs still have the profit objective, they have the reach, they probably know what's happening on the ground. So NBFCs will kind of come in there and do it. So there was this cozy arrangement where it was possible for an NBFC to structure a transaction, and for the mutual fund to be able to take on that paper and offer that credit spread to its investors. Now, what we knew after the ILFS collapse and then the whole NBFC unraveling, the book describes that in beautiful detail, is this, that in the credit system, everybody is interconnected. So it's not possible that an ILFS will have a default of tens of thousands of crores of loans gone down the drain, and there would be no ripple effect on the others who might be co-borrowers, who might be might have a stake in those loans as well. So the whole Diwan housing risks going up as they did has a direct connection to what happened to ILFS, and then the whole NBFC sector collapsed when this credit system fell down. So the idea, therefore, is that when we are looking at the credit space, it's important for us to understand this gap, that we are still managing the risk when it manifests. Now, the book discusses another aspect of this, which is interesting, which is the second important takeaway in my mind, which is this, that let's say that there is a project and there is a borrowing, and let's assume for a moment that the promoter doesn't have the intention to fool anybody. So there is a scrupulous promoter. He has borrowed money and invested in the project, and the project doesn't take off as expected. It fails. World over, what happens? The promoter is hit. The promoter is the one who pays for, because the person who has put in equity, okay, he's the one who takes on the risk. Either he takes on the loss, shuts the business down, and goes out to do something else, or goes bankrupt because he's not able to recover the money because he has staked too much, or sells the last of his assets to be able to stay afloat. What Tamal points out is that in the Indian situation, there is mounting evidence that promoter doesn't have a skin in the game at all. And it's such a risky lending. So the promoter actually gets away. So the bank is just holding on the assets. The promoter doesn't suffer in any manner. Okay. So the personal guarantees are not invoked, or the recoveries are not made from the promoter. It's not as if the promoter has been identified, shamed, except for very highly popular, defaulting promoters like Vijay Mallya or Nirav Modi and a few others. There have been very few promoters who have defaulted, who have found it difficult to raise money again. Who fixes this problem? The owner of the bank. The owner of the bank tells the borrower that unless you have skin in the game, I am not going to lend money to you. What is the big problem in the Indian banking system? The owner in the case of public sector banks is the government. And the government is not creating an environment in which the bank management will actually demand and ask for this requirement. So you have a situation where a set of people are systematically fooling the system. I mean, I think it's known to all of us, but it's important to be able to see the various ways in which this manifests. So when people keep asking the question, will PSU banks survive? Will private sector? That's the important difference. The private sector bank has the incentive to recover its loans because the management, the ownership, the employees, I mean, the whole culture is one that is tuned towards understanding that if we don't recover this loan, all of us will fail. Whereas the PSU banking structure is based on an absolutely hazy idea of, we'll all get bailed out. There's taxpayers' money, and so it's a by definition a weak structure where the promoter has no skin in the game. The owner has no incentive to impose the requirements of good lending on the bank. And there are issues of appointment, and we know all of those politics, right? And therefore, you are left with a situation where people can borrow from banks and systematically fail. And the banks themselves will, keep behaving as if this failure has not happened, because this failure of the loans shows them in poor light, shows the management in poor light. So the management actually tries to kick the can down the road, behaving as if the default has not happened. So what you have, therefore, is that, it's not about private versus public, because we've had the situation of Yes Bank, as someone has just pointed out. Yes Bank is a classic case of evergreening, where you made those loans and the loans did not come, and then you failed to recognize them as NPAs, which brings me to the next point. The core theme of Tamal's book actually is this whole idea of what he calls as zombie banking. It's appalling when one looks at it, and particularly when, advisors or independent practitioners, distributors, or independent practitioners like yourselves are subjected to so much of regulation, scrutiny, code of conduct, ethics, what you can do, what you cannot do. There seems to be so much of debate about excellence. You have to know financial planning, you should talk this language, you have to invest in your in upskilling. I know that the 25-year story of mutual fund distribution, as I can remember, is a story of the distributor, advisor sharpening their skills. Oh, you should know this, you should know this, you should know this, you should get better than this. Okay. But look at the largest player in the financial system. Tamal points out how this largest player has remained incompetent is a strong word, but zombie is the word he uses. Zombie banking in the sense that there is absolutely the components of that whole exercise. There is no skill of project evaluation or project financing or the understanding of how a project will have to be evaluated. How appalling is that? The basic thing, because this was done by development financial institutions like IDBI and others for the longest time. So when in the 90s, when they shut down and all of this infrastructure funding, so we can all talk about how power and coal and all of that became risky. But the truth was, bankers who were lending to these infrastructure projects were leaning on the merchant bankers' account of how viable the project is. There is absolutely no internal, thorough credit evaluation before the loan was given. Appalling. One. Two, there was such an amount of collusion with others. There is this whole discussion about credit rating agencies and all of that. But, coming together, it was only after, Raghuram Rajan decided to have this cell set up to comb out and say, who are the top 100 defaulters? Let's know that. It was then that we were able to find out how, the same borrower was able to borrow from different banks, how the same loan had different banks coming in and taking in different chunks, and how when you recognize that a loan has gone bad, you kind of push it off or sell it off to the cooperative banks. Okay. You sell it off to weaker banks. You kind of package it and say that this is a good thing and give it off to the others. So you have this huge collusion, and ILFS is a shocking story of how the management, everybody from the board going all the way down, credit rating agencies, absolutely with no exception, colluded and connived together and actually handed over loans which were known to be bad. No one expected these loans to be recovered. So to say that bad loans were a result of some political lobbying is oversimplifying it. It happens, but it's oversimplifying it. There is this whole idea of people coming together, this whole disrespect for other person's money. Okay. So you just kind of say that, okay, the bank has this money, let's find a way to kind of get this money. So there's a problem there. And three, of course, the provisioning. When you know that the loan has gone bad, what do you do about it? And how do you provide for it? And how do you make sure that your books are nursed back? So all these three things have not been done. That's it. The crux of the book points to the idea that banking probably is in the hands of a few people who have access to the taxpayers' money, who actually are unwilling to play by the internationally accepted norms of how a lender will behave in terms of the credit appraisal, in terms of the actual sanctioning process, in terms of the recognition and the books, and what would you do when it goes wrong. So the book is a fantastic account of how these things are going wrong. And then, of course, it talks about the way forward. I mean, the government seems to have be thinking today that consolidation is one of the ways of doing it, and so on and so forth. So today, when we India is probably one of the few countries in the world where a good part of banking is still with the public sector, and there is clear weakness. The book points out how there are sterling examples. Tamal has written 2 fantastic books on the HDFC Bank story, which also should be read. They should be read for what leads to robustness in the banking sector. I mean, if pandemonium points out to what is going wrong, the HDFC books point out to what is going right. So that is also a good read. Those are his earlier books. But the parent organization, HDFC, is again one of those standard institutions with the lowest amount of credit risk. It's one of those, 35 years of lending, but absolutely brilliantly beautiful quality assets. I mean, there are different elements to that story, but we know that in India, it is possible to be able to run a credit organization which acts in a certain expert manner and guards its books and makes sure that the provisioning happens as is required and is able to continue with its business. So what's happening is, today, when we are seeing the revival in the economic activity, all the incremental deposits and the incremental credit growth is all happening in the private sector, not happening in the public sector banks. So public sector banks still have the requirement for provisioning. They still have the requirement for capital. They're still struggling with manpower. So what we do have is, see, if Kamal points out a very interesting, comparison. There was a time when we had the labor union, right, which was fighting for the individual. And there was this businesses were saying that, look, it's very difficult for us to hire and to maintain this because unions are kind of not allowing us to do what we have to do. So the story of the 80s, for example, was a story where it was business versus union. Now, what is the story of the last 40 years? The entire labor market has become informal. We have completely moved out of the employment model to the contractual model with all its limitations, and it has completely, so there is this informal, there's a whole informality that's happening with its own exploitative, with its market elements and so on and so forth. Okay. So that is what is happening in finance too. So you have a real requirement for credit, but because the banks are not matching up to that real requirement for credit, you have informal lending that's completely taken over. And if we look at the mutual fund risks that we've seen in the credit space, they all come from this informality. So you are lending in a situation which is not structured in terms of processes, market operations, ability to sell, risk management, none of these. You're just looking at this gap, saying that there is somebody who needs money, there is somebody who has money and doesn't lend. So take the money from him and go and lend it to him and create structures and create systems which will push this money out. And the whole thing is informally set up, which exposes everyone to risks. So that leaves us with this idea that there is still a lot of work to do. I mean, in Raghuram Rajan's interview, characteristically, he says there doesn't seem to be an urgency to fix this problem. I mean, it become a political statement to say anything about that as of now. But the truth is that there is a lot to be fixed as far as the Indian banking is concerned. Right from its expertise in lending, its ability to deal with poor lending, that piece, the piece that is in the media and the piece that keeps coming back again and again is about how projects went wrong and how the government cannot, government also has to take blame. See, we had a situation where, the coal project allocation was modified, the policies towards telecom was modified, policies towards highways was modified. So there was this view that banks, the NPAs happened because these projects, the government changed the rules of the game somewhere in the middle. But what we know today is that the opening up of all of these sectors created a huge amount of crony capitalists. So today, when you look at, I mean, I don't want to mention names, but we know that's what happened in the steel sector, for example. We know how many businesses were set up for every one. The Tamal says that for every one viable project, there were at least 4 others which were set up primarily to take advantage of the fact that, okay, government is encouraging steel, government is building roads, government is opening up the coal sector. So government is encouraging private sector participation in power. So I don't even have the background. So the promoter knows nothing about it, but then just simply decides the bank will give money because the government is encouraging this. So let me kind of put this together. So there is a weak project report and all of this. So when the government comes out and says, look, I am now canceling the coal allocations. Yes, the genuine power producer who depended on that coal mine allocation suffered. But there were 20 others who were just kind of in the game for the money. So the losses to the system from those 20 unscrupulous people is far higher. It's very difficult to argue that change in government policy alone did this. So there are several such stories there, but essentially the book is a good account of what is going wrong. It's a good story of the various threads that have contributed to the mess that is there in banking. And for a distributor in the debt markets, it's important to be able to see how credit risks in this market have played out, so that we will not. Of course, everybody is going to be very cautious with credit stories as we go along. It's important to be able to see how the credit story is weak and perhaps will remain weak for some time to come. So that is like the end of the second section. Is there any question to ask, Dhruv, Amit? Is there anything that I should answer?
I think, ma'am, you need to probably clarify to everyone that you are not giving a short sell on PSU banks tomorrow morning. I think the way you have
No, I am not. No, I am not. I am not. I'm only saying that there is a problem. See, there is
Right.
nothing like this is not yesterday's story. See, if I did a short sell, then there will be a new information, right? There'll be something that's going wrong today.
Right.
Nothing has gone wrong today. The
So,
problem is that this whole PSU banking weakness is a bigger problem. That's all I'm saying. So people are looking at, Dhruv was talking about prices of PSU banks having gone up in the last few days. So people suddenly they saying that, oh, there is an opportunity. More than that, should act with
I
caution.
think whatever the synopsis of whatever you have said about PSU, I think one line will describe it all, saying that ईमान बिकता है, खरीदने वाला चाहिए. So that is one thing which I could make out. But
Yes,
ma'am,
I always say that you can't legislate for integrity. Somehow, we culturally have become a country where if there is an opportunity, you will just jump in there and try to do whatever it takes to, that whole disrespect for other people's money, so to say.
Sure.
And I'm very proud that, mutual fund as a segment has fairly stellar qualities compared to all of this because of the daily NAV. To my mind, that is
yeah, I've
was
been
brilliant
writing.
about mutual funds.
Yeah, I've been writing.
Whatever is going on will have to reflect in the daily NAV, and you can still redeem on the daily NAV, and you will get money tomorrow. Which means that you have the ability. If you believe that something is going wrong, you still have the huge flexibility to redeem. You can walk out of that game.
Yeah.
So it places immense power in the hand of the individual to manage the risk they want to take. Do I want to be here or I don't want to be here? The investor can vote with their feet, and which is a beacon of hope. So we do know to do things right too in the financial sector. Yeah.
I've been jotting down points, ma'am. If we finish the last section, then I can.
Yes. Yes. So the last section is on a behavioral aspect. I will quickly point out. I want to take on one aspect and discuss it. Today, I'm just going to discuss. I'm looking at this book. Oh, let me hold it properly. Okay. Oh, there's no way I can hold it.
Yeah, this is right. You can see it.
Misbehaving. Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. Okay. Now, Misbehaving by Richard Thaler, I'm just going to talk about bargains and ripoffs, which is to say that why is it that people like bargains? Why is it that we think $9.99 is a good price? Or why is it that we will go and buy something that we don't need if the price is right? Why are we very attracted to the price of stuff or the discount that is available on stuff or getting a good deal, so to say? Okay. Why do we want to always get a good deal? Why this is important is that the packaging, because there is a certain way in which people make a decision. How people must decide theoretically is go with what you require, be willing to shop around and ask which is the best place to buy it, and try and buy it at the lowest price that's available in the market. Now, that's not how human beings, that's how the theory will be. That's not how human beings decide. How human beings decide, what behavioral science points out, is that two things. There are two threads there. The joy that you get from acquisition, or the utility of acquisition, and the transactional utility. That's the idea. That there are two things. What we are buying, okay, so we are buying a gadget for 10,000, let us say. It is not just whether that gadget is worth the money that we are paying. It is also about the transaction utility. That's the process. That if they say that this was 12,000 and is now available for 10, there is a joy of sensing that, oh, I actually got a better price. Now, that whole discounting, that deal strategy is one where you're mentally asked to hook yourself to 12,000 as the possible price that you would have paid. And now you're paying 10,000, therefore you're getting. So we can rationally say that many retailers have actually come out and even confessed to marking things up and then offering them a discount because people like the discount. But that is how it is, that we like a deal because we have a certain anchor. I mean, anchoring is an idea in behavioral finance. We have a certain anchor where we are looking at what we could have given. You know, this is what could have happened, but we have done it much better. So buying one, getting one free, or getting a better deal, or getting a lower price, and so on and so forth, is coming from us getting a higher satisfaction from how a transaction happened, or the transactional utility, rather than just the acquisitional utility. So many times, I mean, every seller knows this, that how you packaging a deal is much more important, how it's being perceived. So there is a perception in the mind of the investor that this is what I should have paid for it. So there is a way in which that expectation is pitched at a higher level. So saying that this is exclusive, only a few people will buy this, are getting this, etc., are also those tactics where we are trying to say that you belong to an exclusive club when you do this. So the acquisition utilities are all pushed up, where you feel very good when you're actually doing the transaction. So I wanted you to look at this as an idea in human behavior, where it is not just the transaction, it is also how the transaction happens and what expectations get created. If you're able to throw in the idea, I mean, all my friends in Gujarat will completely identify with this. There has to be a bargain that's thrown in. Then, you know, only then it becomes so much more attractive. Yeah, so that is something which I want to talk about. And the last thing I wanted to say before we go is about the asset allocation idea. There is this simple idea of value add on asset allocation. It's a simple math, hugely useful in your practice. All that you want to say is, if your investor had remained, let us say January, the investor was 60% equity, 30% debt, 10% liquid, let's say. Okay. So December, we are in December today. If that was the asset allocation, use the indices and find out what is the return the investor would have gotten end of December. That is benchmark absolute return without the intervention of any advisor, distributor telling the investor what to do. Your value add from asset allocation is how you changed that. Did you change that 60? Did you reduce that 60%? Did you increase that 10%? Did you modify? So you could have modified, or the kind of funds that you provided, because you're using index, right? So you are calculating both timing and selection, whether you modified those ratios and whether you suggested better products in terms of where the equity investments should be or where the debt investments should be. What's the actual return the investor made? The difference between these two is the advisor's alpha. It's a precious idea. That's your value add. Now, the advisor's alpha is very similar to the fund manager's alpha. So because of you, your investor could have done better than the benchmark. Because of you, your investor could have lost lesser than the benchmark. Very valuable in a year like the current one. So to be able to, one of the core things in asset allocation practice is being able to build these two benchmarks, be able to say how it's something for the distributor to do by themselves, or for the association, or for a research or someone to do it, but establishing the value and being able to talk about that value again and again is an important idea. We've neglected it for a long time, but I do believe that in asset allocation we need to, because it is only with asset allocation that you can talk about absolute returns. See, everybody else will talk about market returns. The market was this was, but whereas when we're talking to the investor's saying, I want 10%. So you have said this percent is going to generate for you the return that you want. So you want to be able to point out how often was that achieved, how often was that exceeded, and where it fell down because of markets, how you were able to make it better. So advisors alpha or asset allocation, value add from asset allocation is an important idea. So that is the end of the first session that I wanted to talk to you about. So a quick summary that, nobody is going to increase interest rates. We're going to be looking at liquidity. read up Tamal's book if you can, or if you don't have the time, remember the zombie banking problems and the credit market issues that we have, because money is in the hand of those who probably don't know to lend. Three, remember that the buying experience is much more valuable than what is actually being bought. So there are things to do with making that buying experience good. And value add from asset allocation is your contribution to the table. So try and see if that can be quantified. Over to you, Amit. So that's where we are.
Dhruv sir, should we start, or you have a observation or some point to probably?
No, Amit, I think you can start.
Yeah. So, ma'am, couple of points which I put out was that the cost of money and availability of money both are in abundance today. So you have got cost of money which is cheap for most of the corporates. I mean, a March 21 Berger Paints raised money at 1.9%. Can you believe that?
Yeah, sure.
The cost of money has really gone down.
Yes.
And the availability of money, as you rightly said, in terms of liquidity sloshing around worldwide, has also been the case in India. So the availability of money has also been pretty nice, and therefore you have a lower for longer kind of rate scenario which has been prevalent for the last 1 year now. But when we talk of risk on trade and flight to safety, and currently we are at flight to liquidity. So do you believe that from the flight to liquidity to the risk on trade, in between we'll have something like flight to safety, where because of the withdrawal in liquidity, you will have people actually facing some turbulence in the debt markets, and in the next 6 to 9 months, whether irrespective of the policy rates, will the market rates actually suggest something different? Because this was the same scenario in 2014 to 16, where the 10-year went up rapidly and then the CRR repo hikes happened. So are we looking at something like that in the coming 6 to 9 months? That was the first question.
Okay. See, when you have a problem and then there is a recovery, the recovery is not really quick. I mean, we spoke about, V-shaped recovery and so on and so forth. So the recovery is not really quick. So, sorry. So the thing is that lenders will remain cautious, and it's only the better quality. So when we say flight to quality, I won't say there has been a crisis of that kind. We've had more of a pause than an event-based risk. If you had a situation where there was an event-based risk, then the flight to quality as an idea will become very important. Today, I don't think that's the problem today. The COVID problem has affected everybody. So the idea is really revival of economic activity more than anything else. Businesses are operating at much lower than capacity. So I will look at capacity utilizations. I will look at revival numbers. I will look at revenue numbers, uptick in top line numbers, return of suppliers and return of demand in the market, and so on and so forth as indicators. So we will see a gradual uptick in credit across sectors, but I don't personally see it happening immediately in the scale that will excite all of us. So there is going to be a restart, but that's going to be gradual. It's going to be across the board. It's not going to be selective, as you're pointing out. It's going to be across the board. Everybody will come into the market. So it's important to keep the rates low as long as this activity has become high enough to start reflecting in GDP. So that reflection in GDP is a March 2022 idea, Amit.
Yeah.
So no one is looking for these numbers to look good before 22.
Okay. And why the question on policy rates versus market rates is if you try to look at the depth of the corporate debt market in India, we have seen today that from the capital raise and the stake sale, which one of the big corporate houses in India, which have done over the last 6 months, now almost 13 corporates account for 52% of the debt market flows in the mutual fund industry. Now, suppose tomorrow some of them wake up to the wrong side of the bed and say we want to redeem. Is there enough depth in the market wherein there is somebody who can actually buy those bonds, which the funds have? Because all of this has led to the fall in the yields on the shorter end. If these guys actually move out, the policy rates might be late in responding, but the market rates actually will suggest a different story.
Correct. But it won't be jerky, Amit. That's our, see, that's the biggest benefit when it comes to the mutual fund business.
Okay.
In in the corporate money that we've had. I mean, unless there is really like we had the exchange rate crisis or we had, unless there is a shock that is there in the system, most of these will be gradual. Most of these will be happening over a period of time. So we'll be fine. So even if there is going to be, there will be low rates for quite some time, but the spreads will be low when we begin, but the spreads will definitely start becoming better as credit picks up. But that's going to happen gradually over all of 2021.
Okay, we've
so
seen
being engaged with the market is still going to be beneficial, because as the shift comes from liquid, it won't be liquid to the long end of the curve. It will be liquid to shorter end, liquid to, 3 to 5 year markets and so on and so forth. So there will be an opportunity to
I think the
participate.
smarter investors actually did a step up of their maturities, wherein they went from liquid to ultra, then ultra to low duration, and low duration to
Correct.
short.
Correct. So you, all of that, as I said, with the exception of credit opportunity, I think most of those products will see investor involvement. I won't write off credit opportunity, because in our country, given the low level of credit penetration, there is absolute imperative for money to reach people. And even if you see the relief packages given by the government, MSME is the single largest consumer of credit. Okay, so we have to find ways to make money available to the large borrowers, to the smaller borrowers, to the smaller and medium-sized borrowers who are still dependent on informal sources of money. So there is a job to be done there, but I don't see it happening in the next 6 months.
Okay.
So if one were to take a 10-year view of Indian credit markets, if one has the audacity to do it, one would say that these markets will become qualitatively good only if we are able to lend well.
Right. Right. For people like us who are selling mutual funds to retail and to MNIs day in, day out, for a 3-year period now, a lot of questions on the panel which asks as to what's your view on the banking PSU funds, and what's your view on, in general, the debt markets for a 3-year view, where should one allocate money?
See, debt market is you just cannot avoid the debt market. Okay, so and it's nice. It's a nice piece that offers that cushion. Okay, so if something were to go wrong with the equity market, you have a cushion. So you can't really have too much of an allocation. Even the boldest of investors will look at 80% equity allocation. So you still are looking at 20 allocation to debt market. So debt market is will I be in equity or not is a question many investors may ask, but debt market is like default choice. So we always say everybody must have a liquid fund, everybody must have an ultra short-term fund, everybody must have a 3 to 5 year short-term debt product, and using tactically indulging in the GSEC funds have offered us returns too. So the question is not of whether you should, it's like a default choice. You need to be present. You choose carefully, and all of that is there. This is the job of all of you. But every investor, there is no avoiding the debt market. You can't. And we are not saying that things are so bad that you have to pick up everything and run. We are not in that place. Okay. So there is so that is one thing. Now the next 2-3 years, the thing is that we have to watch out what is the next new thing. Because what will typically happen is, you tried this, we tried this, and then we tried to borrow like this, and then we found that that's not working, and then this led to a crisis, etc. Then the next new thing will come.
Right.
So we need to, I will see the next 3 years as a time when some innovation will happen. Somebody will come up with some different structure. Somebody will come up with some different product. So it'll be good times, and these will be, what do you say? These investing in the cusp of that change in the market is safe because people won't come up with audacious ideas. No, people will be scared of coming up with, there won't be the confidence that anything will sell.
So does that
People will ask a lot of questions. So you can be very sure, and at times like we are in now, you can be very sure that sensible, good, longer term, nice product launches and innovations will happen. Risky, audacious things will not happen. So it's a good place for the investor to be in.
some of the things which the government did, RBI did in terms of the write-off of the tier 1 for Yes Bank, and then now LVB completely written off, and then somebody taking over that bank. I think that has probably ruffled some feathers because many of the funds also had exposure to perpetual bonds, and they still do have exposure to perpetual bonds. Is there something what we need to have as a caution that maybe look at only 4 or 5 banks on the perpetual bond side, or you feel that it's as risky even if it's with the top 4 or 5 banks?
See, you will look at whether the equity investors have skin in the game, as I was saying, that, is the bank capitalized, well capitalized? Otherwise, is there seriously a reduction in the NPAs, and is the bank's balance sheet qualitatively looking better? And whether, apart from the funding and other things that have happened, whether there are actual changes in how the bank is conducting its operations. So today, consolidation is the name of the game. So the government, 1 lakh crores is not easy to raise. We want to try and recapitalize all the PSUs.
Yeah.
We don't have that kind of money. And if credit expands, and even if a small percentage of that, if credit grows, let's say the next 3 years credit grows, along with that, the NPA will also grow at 10%, right?
Yes.
So that 10% requires funding. So it's a constant problem. So the thing really, therefore, is banks' perpetual bond as a product will be there because you are looking at tier 2. You are looking at being able to capitalizing the bank is an issue that we have to face. If the bank is otherwise good, if this bank is capitalized and it can live, we would want that bank to live. I think that's the thinking from the policy angle. Shutting down is not something that is being thought of. Consolidation, LVB is a special case because for the first time we've had equity investors lose.
Yes.
To my mind, that's an important signal. Because if there is a risk, equity investors should be the ones that are losing. It's not the lender.
Yeah.
So for the government to boldly say that equity investors will get nothing is something. I mean, that's a benchmark to my mind. We haven't had that instance before. So grappling with how the equity of the bank will be funded is going to be a problem which we're going to face. But as investors, all I'm saying is that we have choices. We don't have to keep, just like the PSU management will keep banging its head on NPAs and saying, I somehow have to evergreen this, I somehow have to make this good, I have to somehow make this work. We don't have to be obsessed with weaker banks and say this somehow should turn around. We can move on.
Right. You spoke about crony capitalism. Is that when the GDP actually goes above 8% and when there is free credit available everywhere, that's when this crony capitalism actually comes to play? Because then you are in a situation where wherever you put money, you feel that you will make money, maybe double or thrice in a matter of 5 to 10 years. And that's when the banker actually starts opening his purses and start giving out or doles out credit. So is that the government's probably rule that since they have a large mandate, the first 4 years will be socialism and the last year will be capitalism? And that's how
I don't want to make this answer political. Okay, but the truth is that this whole jugaad is a cultural issue, So wherever money is available, people will find some ways to go and access it. That's the problem we have. So it's not about the government. It's largely about the culture that we have, we are I don't know whether it's coming from entitlement or whether it is coming from this huge sense of unfairness. There are so many views there. People say that India has a poor integrity issue because there's a problem with distribution. Some people end up becoming rich, and the others feel that it is okay to steal from him because he has not become rich by fair means.
Yeah.
Okay. So this whole, it's very difficult to solve for it. You know, very difficult to solve for the possibility that the moment you open the tap of money, it is not about the unscrupulous borrowers coming in. The problem is that they nudge the other good quality ones and try to hog what is available. So in a poor country where there's only limited amount of something available, if they entitled, that's the problem with crony capitalism. If they entitled come in and change the market, we know that that's what has happened with a sale of land. I mean, highway projects, if you look at a sale of land, we know that large, well-moneyed people have gone in and simply squatted and taken over all of that land, and today are demanding higher prices, making it extremely difficult for highway projects to acquire land. And the whole land acquisition idea today has become so muddled with these inflated prices that have come from these squatters. So the same is true for real estate. We know that there is oversupply, but prices will not fall because the market has been funded by people who do not want to lose money. So they say, you cannot sell this flat for any price lower than what I bought it from, because the moment the prices drop, my investment is going to lose value. So there's no mark to market there. That's what I was trying to point out.
Yeah.
The real estate market doesn't have a mark to market. So those are issues that we have. So, I mean, these are cultural issues, and recklessness about other people's money, and willingness to grab what is not ours. I do believe that prosperity will address some of this, you know, where if it is possible to earn money through fair means, then, probably, I don't know really, I'm not a social scientist, but crony capitalism is not going to leave us soon.
That brings me to the next question.
If there is money, unscrupulous guys will come and access.
Yeah. So this leads me to another question, that is it fair to assume that when you have the housing loan rate lesser than that of the Provident Fund, your real estate market actually booms? So you have a SBI home loan at 6.9 and you have the PPF at 7.1. Is it fair to assume that lower rate than the PPF on the housing loan will actually trigger a rally in the real estate market?
We all love real estate.
Yeah.
That's the problem. You know, the real estate market is actually such a dirty market of thugs, you know. I mean, I feel so, the real estate market is filled with all kind of unscrupulous elements, you know. But the investor somehow will not let go of this market. Investor somehow thinks that real estate is a good thing to do, and, you know, I must have more and more houses, and I don't know what they're going to do with those houses anyway. So real estate is something the investor will not let go. So if you were to ask me for a view, the first signs of revival in the market, real estate is what will revive. Everybody will go back to buying houses.
Yeah.
So the first retail loan that will take off is housing loan. So the demand for those loans will still provide the opportunity. So rates are lower today more as an aberration is what I would think. I would think that banks' ability to raise interest rates will manifest in real estate because there'll be so much of interest. It's a historical thing. We all love to buy property. So that's one market where, despite everything, there will be people wanting to buy.
Right. So I have just one last observation. I think everybody is talking of a new high on the equity market every day, and nobody is actually able to fathom as to whether we want to invest or whether we want to cash out. But I feel that insolvency will hit you before sanity does if you try to time the markets on equity as well as on debt. Dhruv sir, I had these questions in mind. Anything if you want to add? Thank you, Uma ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit. Thank you.
So I think, Rupa Sangeeta, you can take some of the questions which the members have been asking.
So,
Uma, sorry, okay.
yeah, carry on,
Rupa.
Sangeeta, carry on.
Uma, somebody is asking, what is the view on the interest rates going forward?
Yeah, we said that, right? There's no scope to increase it in the next 6 months. I can bet my hat and say that there is no scope. You can't. So, bringing it down beyond this is also going to be ridiculous because the inflation target is 4%. You're already sub 4%. So bringing it down any further is going to be difficult. But if growth never responds, you don't know what the RBI can do. And but taking it up is out of the question. So the best case scenario is status quo, and a small probability that there won't be growth and the RBI will be forced to take it down even further. There's a small possibility that will happen. I won't give that more than 25 basis or at the most 50 basis. So that's even like a RBI relenting because growth has not happened. That also might happen 9 months to a year down the lane, not in the next 6 months. So the next 6 months, best case scenario is status quo. And increasing interest rates, I don't see. I mean, I won't even begin that discussion before 2022 March.
Oh, so if it's 2022, so another question which is there. So somebody says moving from liquid to floater. So that also does not make sense at this point of time.
No. Earn what is available on the table. It's safe, small, and steady.
Okay. But there doesn't seem to be any asset class in debt, at least, which can give a return, because liquid funds are giving a return which is sub 3%, or any even corporate bond or PSU bond, even for a period of 3 years, does not give more than 4.5% return. And credit funds today, people are shying away because of the ILFS, DHFL, and other issues which have happened. So where can one get a return in the debt market?
Inflation numbers that are around 4. So if you're staying afloat at 4 plus, you're good. Because that's where we are now. There is a pickup. There's a pickup in economic activity and borrowing activity. Then you will find that interest rates will start looking up. At this point of time, there's too much money in the system for returns to be any higher than this. We need economic activity to pick up for any of these opportunities to come the investors' way. So as of now, it is, which is also, there was a question on equity. Now, if you're in this phase where it's unknown, safety of your money is going to be your biggest concern, right? So it is absolutely not a bad strategy to simply keep your money in liquid ultra short and just wait. There's no problem. Jumping into the market now before anything is clear in terms of growth is only risky. So you will participate in the equity market to the extent that there are good quality businesses that are that are showing top line growth, because we still do not know how bottom lines are going to look like. So if there is top line growth that is visible in businesses, yes, there is a case to be in equity markets. There's always a case to be in equity markets. But as far as debt markets is concerned, I think liquid return is all that one can expect in the next 6 months. As I said, these are times when innovation will happen. While you and I are not seeing it, players in the market with the requirement to productize will come up with something. So we must keep our eyes and ears open to new product structures.
But what do you think about the NPAs, even in the private banking, in the coming 6 months?
They are, fortunately, compared to the public sector counterparts, they are well capitalized. So they will simply take that hit. They will provision, they will take that hit and come back. Okay. They have no choice. I don't see weakness in private sector banks. I do see that, and then there is competition. That's the thing, that for every PSU bank or a private sector bank with a weak balance sheet, there are half a dozen banks with strong balance sheets that are capturing the market. So, so that will happen. So the better banks will become bigger.
Yeah, Rupa.
So Uma, I'm just reading out certain questions, which I think there are some questions. I think Amit has already taken up those questions, but there are some questions. One of them being saying that do you think that the small rise in economic activity is more due to the pent-up demand rather than the normal one?
Economic activity has to always be going up only. That's the nature, right? Just like how a tree will grow. You can't really have economy standing still. So while you and I are sitting here and worrying about how to, what will happen to the economy, wedding caterers who have waited for 9 months for the events to come back have today started delivering package meals. So I received wedding invitations in which my cousins are saying, our daughter is getting married and the wedding is on Zoom. But please note that your sapadu will arrive at 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
So the caterer has completely packed the entire meal and is going and delivering it to all these 500 people who would have otherwise attended the wedding. So economic activity will find a way. People will find a way to stay alive. People will find a way to get demand back for their businesses. There's a struggle as of now because there has been a all-round, unexpected, all-round severe shock, but revival will happen. I mean, there is no reason to believe that economic revival will not happen. So 10-year view on equity, your money must be there today. You can't keep it.
Perfect. Also, then there's a question called, can you elaborate on the asset allocation and how to market the IFA alpha?
Yes, I mean, that's the point I made where I'm saying that find a benchmark, just like how a mutual fund has found an index as a benchmark. Okay. Find benchmarks for debt returns. They can be bank deposit returns for all you know. Okay. Debt returns for equity, you have the index. And for liquid, you have the repo rates, for example. Okay. So if there is 10% allocation to liquid, you are taking the repo rate. If there is 40% allocation to debt, you're taking the 1-year deposit rate. And if there is 50% allocation to equity, you're taking the Nifty return. Okay. So then you're just doing the math, multiplying the allocation with this rate and saying that this is the amount of return you would have earned. So let's say that turns out to be something like 8% or whatever return. If the investor's actual portfolio has earned anything more than that, that's your alpha. You are the one who completely contributed to that number. That's yours.
So which means what you're saying is saying that, Uma, we need to highlight it more than, because normally what happens is we don't highlight it.
Yes, you have to go and claim it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, you have to go and claim
managers all the time saying, I'm beating the benchmark, I'm beating the benchmark. Yeah. You need to be able to say, if I were not present, this is what you would have done.
Perfect. Got it. I think you've completed on the interest rate scenario. There's one question which talks about saying that what's your insight on the scope of the insurance and the insurance and asset management companies in India? I don't know if you want to answer that.
I will probably take it up in another session where we're talking about both. I mean, it's a huge new topic in itself. I think I'll stay within the scope of what we plan to discuss this session.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So I think most of them were on interest rates and all, and I think that is all being covered. And there are a few questions which they are asking, saying that they wanted to ask that book that you wrote about, or that you showed on asset allocation and behavioral. They want to see that book and the name of those books. Yeah, Misbehaving. Tila. Yeah. So Dhruv?
Yeah, so if I can ask Uma, what you mentioned on Tamal's book and on the whole banking, the problem is maybe, as you said, poor credit underwriting, or the assessment of the credit risk by the banking sector.
It's lack of supervision, Dhruv, that I must mention that also, both.
So that's where you mentioned that the private sector banks, some of them are doing much better, and therefore they could continue to do well. Do you also see that what you mentioned is the mutual fund space is much smaller? Some of the mutual fund space have entered the credit space. And do you see that over the next 10 years? Because I think that in the global markets, mutual funds do play a lot of role in terms
Yes.
of...
Yes, because this is a superior, as I said right at the start, Dhruv, the mutual fund idea of market assessment every day using NAV and managing risks on expectation basis rather than waiting to provide them, because mutual funds don't have capital like banks. So what you're owning is what you're giving the investor. So your NAV has to fairly depict what the value is. And in an open-ended fund, investors are actively moving in and out on that price. So it's very important for you to get that NAV right. So the brilliance about mutual fund as a product is its daily NAV. That's because it offers such a important risk management tool for the investor. Okay. The tragedy for the mutual fund is that service that it is able to give its investors is not available to itself. So I have to disclose the daily NAV, but the products that I am holding are illiquid and there isn't a counterparty at all times to be able to buy this from me at a price which I will require. So I provide liquidity, but I don't get that liquidity. So mutual funds as an intermediary are playing an extremely valuable role in activating these markets. And we know that there have been markets which would have been dead if not for mutual funds. Consider commercial paper, for example. Commercial paper as an idea would be dead if mutual funds were not there. Right. So you do know that the presence of a player with the ability to mark to market and be willing to buy and sell adds to the health of the market. We really need more allies for the mutual fund business, or for the mutual fund business to be able to find out what is the better way in which to take care of this requirement for credit and the failure of banks. Mutual funds rank high, they privately held and rank high on innovation, and you must watch the space. They'll come up with something.
Okay. The second question I had on the asset allocation, what you mentioned, very important for us to demonstrate value of the alpha that we generate. But one of the other things that I think we should, as advisors, communicate to clients, what I believe is that what is shown by a lot of studies is that investors, when they invest on their own, don't achieve the benchmark return or the underlying fund return. Because they get...
but Dhruv, the problem is really this. The investor won't share. One, he won't measure this objectively. And even if he did, he won't share it with you. We all know, right? The investor will only talk about his successes. He won't talk about failures. He will say how he invested in something and how that has become multiple. And then for that one story, there will be some 20 stories of absolute duds that are rotting. They won't talk about it. And unless they disclose it, we have no access to it, right?
Yeah, but I think if we have to show, what a lot of studies Vanguard has done, that the investor return...
There is no doubt that investors on their own are worse off because, because of two things. One, they don't buy what is required to be bought, one. And two, as we always point out, right, the advisors value from saying no. If you stopped an investor from doing something, you're not made a commission out of it, right? You tell the investor, don't do this. This is not good. This is not going to serve your financial goal, or this is going to be risky. Doing this at this time is not good. You're making no commission on that recommendation, but the investor is saving himself from a tremendous amount of loss by heeding to your advice. Now that's also value add, right?
Right. So when
that value add can be found by looking at how much the investor would have lost and how you reduce that loss by intervening.
Yeah. So related to the asset allocation is that typically what I've seen is that most of us advisors are used to now, in terms of when we advise on asset allocation in terms of equity, you talk about large cap, mid cap, small cap, and you do some sort of allocation. that client's portfolio is, more large cap, because that's how the market is. But I think in fixed income, somehow I don't see too much of discussion on the asset allocation in terms of your debt investments. So typically,
Yeah.
the way I think, if we, when you put money in debt, it's for safety, it's for liquidity, and the last is the return. So when you're looking at the safety aspect, typically the money should go in a very AAA sort of, or a GSEC bond. And if it is liquid, then it needs to be shorter end, because those are the papers which are liquid in the market. So the third is, the return. The spreads. The spreads come when you move up the credit curve. So I think this concept that, customer, when he's looking at fixed income, either he's very simply looking at putting money in a fixed deposit. Correct. And if you are to suggest to him that on a long-term basis, you create a portfolio, I'm just saying, throwing a number, say 1/3 is very liquid, low duration, ultra short, and it's all AAA. Then you have the 1/3 of the portion which is into GSEC. It could be medium or a dynamic bond fund, where it is on the longer end. And then maybe 1/3 or 20% is on the credit risk base. And I think today, there is a lot of misconception on the credit risk space, in the sense that the distinction between investment grade and junk bonds, in Indian context, you have the AAA space. Everybody wants to be 100% on the AAA space, but you have the AA plus, you have the AA. These are not bad category of credits. So I think in the fixed income space also, this thought that you divide, supposing you want to have in non-AAA just 5% or 10%, that's what one needs to think about, and create a portfolio. Because I think the way interest rates are today, and over the last 1 year also, we've seen sometimes the rate movements are so sharp that it's not always very easy to maneuver portfolios based on the outlook for the next 1 or 2 years. And clients, as you said, clients put money into debt because of safety. It's not really the return that is driving them. They know their benchmark. Most of them know what they're getting in a bank FD, and if they get similar returns, I think if we create portfolios which are, in these sort of 3 buckets, and you don't overweight one. So I think I just wanted your thoughts, Ki, in terms of how to look at asset allocation on the fixed income space.
What you've described is a good one, Dhruv, because those are the segments that are available. So and mutual funds have defined that space fairly well, and also thrown in a dynamic bond as an idea, to say that if you don't want to do it, we will do it for you, kind of a product. And we know very well how the investor behavior is. So either they will run all out. See, today we are, I don't want to mention names, but then I do talk of, I'm using this purely from a point of view of example. They are a client. Today we are saying, Templeton did this, and Templeton's funds have this have happened, and therefore, what we should do. But I just want to take you back to the time when Templeton launched the first credit opportunity fund. And what happened when the second product was offered? How investors lined up. Yeah. At that time, Templeton was the innovative identifier of the credit opportunity space. We all know that they were the first ones to be present there, right?
Right.
So, and how investors were queuing in to invest in the same product. So, investors rushing to something which is performing is something which we have seen again and again and again. So once it is on the board as a top performing idea, whether it is a small cap fund, whether it is a emerging, winners, or whichever name it is provided to that category, investors tend to rush, because investor behavior is to look at past winners as a way to select the next product. So today there is caution, because which is where the distributor advisor's role comes in. where you want to be able to tell the investor that investing should not remain that kind of a tactical idea. So what you're saying is valuable in terms of saying, look, these three segments are available to us. There is a base rate, liquid rate that's available to you. There is a little short-term credit spread that's available. The problem or the gap is in the long-term credit spread. And as you rightly pointed out, beyond AAA, there is really no market. For the longest time, I mean, I have been on so many of these panels on debt markets that at some point we said, look, we are saying the same things. We've been saying the same things in terms of what needs to be done here. So the long-term debt market in India is seriously in need of reforms. And one of those is to be able to have a market for junk bonds. Think about it like this. In India, we find so much of opportunity in every economic good. There is an extremely elaborate market for raddi, sorting and selling and doing it. So anything of economic value, culturally, we know how to sell it and create a market for it. The problem is institutional roadblocks, because this bonds are not in the retail investors' hands. If this market were a retail market, by now we would have a junk bond market. Because this market is in the hands of institutions, and because these institutions do not want to trade their portfolio, like a provident fund will not look at changing value of its this thing and say, okay, I'm holding this bond and it looks like its credit is deteriorating. I will sell it off at 80. Is there a buyer? So there emerges a buyer who says, okay, I'll take, I think at 80, it is a good buy because this will revive, and so on and so forth. We don't have it. So that is that space where long-term debt is, GSEC is another segment. So it's not available. So a fund manager today works within these constraints. So if you're going to look at 3-year plus, identifying a basket of products that are going to be, good enough for incorporating into the portfolio and managing risks with a daily NAV knife on above his head is a question, right? Which is the reason why the debt fund space is largely confined to the sub 3-year space on one side and GSEC on the other. It's just the lack of opportunity in the market. As I said, for the last 20 years, we've been talking about revival of the corporate debt market and nothing has happened there. We need to have more institutions willing to trade their debt, willing to recognize there is risk, willing to recognize that there is a market price that can price that risk and be able to take that hit and go and trade it. I don't know whether that's happening soon. Mutual funds are the only people standing there.
Yeah. Okay.
A fund manager will be more than willing to do it. He knows that this is the best thing to do and he's more than willing to do it. There is no counterpart.
Dhruv, there is one question, if I can ask.
Please.
How we can evaluate mutual funds or debt mutual funds to avoid Franklin-like experience? Would diversification would be the answer to that?
Yeah, obviously. And we must remember, we must treat exceptions as exceptions. We shouldn't make it as, So, and it's not ethical for me to
Right.
get into a specific discussion on Franklin's situation. But I do understand that fund selection for the distributor and the advisor, fortunately, fund selection is available, and it is still the case that in the mutual fund business, you can sell multiple products. You're not wedded to a particular fund entity, which opens the entire market to you in terms of product selection. You can pretty much do what you want. So yes, Rupa, diversification so accidents are what they are. We can't.
Yeah.
If we are able to foresee these things, then life will be much easier.
So I think I'll take up the last question, Uma. It's like CIBIL, how many MF companies are tracking the companies which are borrowing from mutual funds? Since there are 40 plus, same companies can borrow money from 10 AMCs.
It is a great question. Mutual funds are primarily reliant on market information as their way to get around, because there isn't a, what do you say, in the way in which mutual funds lend money or operate, there are no structures of this kind. It's not a lending transaction. It's an investment in a bond. Okay, so the structures that are available, the credit analysis, or if there is credit loan evaluation there is credit rating here. Okay, if there is provisioning there is market for selling here. So if there is civil there is just market information here. So in most structures in which mutual funds have engaged with consortiums to be able to create structures for lending money, they do track this information. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't a formalized tracking like CIBIL. CIBIL is more the retail tracking, so to say. But I was telling you about the Raghuram Rajan-led tracking of lenders and that whole operation in the Cuff Parade office of RBI, which Tamal very dramatically explains. They took day and night of work of the best brains to be able to figure how these transactions are linked. It took them so much of time. So it's one of those institutional reforms required in the debt market. I have no clue when and how that can come. But until then, market information is our only source.
Oh, sure.
As an investing organization, you will rely on market information anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Because you will say that, I won't wait for the NPA. I will look at the share price and say that, look, something is going wrong with the repaying applicable.
Yeah.
So credit risk of a borrower is manifest in the share price first before he actually begins to default. So that's how a mutual fund will work. Rely more on market information than other things.
Dhruv, you can take it over.
Gaming the system is something that happens systematically in India, which is a problem. So there are many questions that ask about specific instances. Dhruv, I feel so sorry about it, but as a society, I think we do have this integrity issue. It's a sad thing.
But does it only happen in India, or it happens around the world, or it's just that because even in China,
happen. See, it's difficult to happen, for example, in another place because of competition.
Okay.
Somebody or the other will figure, that this is what you're doing and out you, or come and do better than you, and so on and so forth. So this collusion, both the integrity and collusion. Not only are there thieves, but they're all ganging up together. So that's a problem. So, and poor supervision. See, that's what research says about thievery, right? It says that there's going to be a theft when no one is watching. You can get away with it. And there is an object. So if there is money on my table, which I have left, and somebody is walking into the room, the person will pick up that money if they want to pick it up, okay, which is the integrity issue. I mean, even if it is not my money, it is lying there, but you will not pick it up if you're worried that you will be caught and shamed. So most of the time, we don't pick up a bag on that's the example we give, on the luggage carousel at the airport. All bags are coming in, and what is the probability? Why is it that people don't pick up another person's bag? You are worried about being shamed of the real owner. You don't know anonymity. The real owner might be standing next to you, and if you picked up her bag, he might hold your hand and say, hey, that's my bag. So you're worried about being shamed. And therefore, you don't pick up somebody else's bag. So there are simple fixes like that. So we can behave with absolute integrity in a luggage carousel, but we can't behave very with great honesty when it comes to money. So interesting behavioral ideas. Yeah.
Thanks, Uma. Dhruv?
Dhruv,
You're muted, I think, Dhruv. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think there are a few questions which are related to the equity markets on ESG funds, international funds. We'll leave those for another day because I think it requires a much larger discussion. We are going to have a regular monthly session with with Uma, and I think maybe even if we have not answered all the questions today, I request all the members, participants to send us your questions to response, and we will try and get them addressed in the next session.
Yes, Dhruv. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll keep a section where I will pick up a few of these. I'll take these
Questions. Yeah.
and I'll address them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all our participants. We would like to know how, we would definitely like your feedback, because that will actually encourage us and Uma to do something better for you, so that it makes a difference for you and your clients. So we definitely want all of your views.
Thank
Thank
you.
So there is a feedback form also. Madhu,
Yeah,
you have sent the feedback form, right?
Yeah, I am sharing the feedback link here, everybody.
Thank you, Uma.
Thank you.
And we look forward every month
Yeah,
for your session.
it was a pleasure. Thank you, Dhruv, Sangeeta, and Rupa. It was a pleasure talking, and I'm very happy that CL is
Yeah.
able to do this for you again. And thanks to technology, I'm able to talk to an audience that I hold so dearly to my heart. You know, I spent all my life talking to distributors and advisors to connect again. And when I see the chat and I find so many familiar names, it feels very good. I am very glad to be connecting again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, Uma.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Yes.
Thank you. You all too.
Yeah.
Thank you.